My name is Victor, and if you are also over 50, I want to say something to you right now that most people in this world will never have the courage to say out loud. I have spent the better part of 6 decades acquiring things, studying markets, studying people, understanding how capital moves through the world. And I can tell you with the kind of certainty that only comes from having lived long enough to watch the entire arc of a life play out, not just my own, but the lives of dozens of people who built extraordinary wealth, that the single most dangerous myth circulating among our generation is this: that financial success, if pursued with enough discipline and enough sacrifice, will eventually produce a life worth living. It will not. And I do not say that to be provocative. I say it because I have sat across from men and women in their late 60s and 70s, brilliant people, disciplined people, people who did everything right by every conventional financial metric. And I have watched the realization settle into their eyes like cold water. The portfolios were real, the properties were real, the net worth was absolutely real, but the life, the actual texture and meaning and warmth of the life, that had quietly been traded away, one prioritized deal at a time, one missed moment at a time, across 30 or 40 years of relentless, intelligent, completely misguided focus. This is what I want to talk about today, not the mechanics of wealth creation. You've likely spent decades mastering those. I want to talk about what happens after the wealth arrives, what the scoreboard actually looks like at 60, at 65, at 70, and more importantly, I want to talk about the specific, actionable realities that separate the people in our generation who are genuinely, deeply, quietly at peace, from the ones who are surrounded by evidence of success and haunted by an emptiness they cannot quite name. Because here is the truth that no financial advisor will tell you and no retirement planning seminar will put on a slide. Money is not the destination. It never was. Money is a tool, an extraordinarily powerful tool, one of the most powerful tools human civilization has ever produced. But a tool is only as valuable as the clarity with which you understand what you are trying to build. And for most of us, for most of our productive decades, we were so absorbed in sharpening the tool that we never stopped to seriously interrogate the blueprint. Let me take you back to something I observed over many years watching both successful and quietly failed lives unfold. In your 20s and 30s, and for many of us over 50, this is now a long time ago, but try to remember the feeling. In those years, money was a proxy for everything. It was proof of intelligence. It was proof of capability. It was the answer to the anxiety that sat just beneath the surface of every ambitious person's life, that low hum of not enoughness that drove us out of bed before the alarm and kept us at desks long after everyone else had gone home. We believed, genuinely and deeply believed, that once a certain number was reached, a certain level of financial security, a certain portfolio size, a certain annual income, the anxiety would dissolve. The restlessness would quiet. The sense of having arrived would finally, permanently land. It does not work that way. I have never met a single person for whom it worked that way. Not one. Not. What happens instead is this. Every financial milestone you reach simply recalibrates your definition of enough. You wanted to own your first property, and then you owned it, and within 6 months you were thinking about the next one. You wanted to build your first million, and then you built it, and within a year the conversation had shifted entirely to the next tier. The hedonic treadmill, and this is not a metaphor, this is a well-documented psychological mechanism, runs in perfectly precise lockstep with your financial advancement. You can never outrun it by running faster. The only way off is to step sideways entirely. And stepping sideways requires a different kind of courage than the courage that built your financial life, because the courage that built your financial life was, at its core, the courage of acquisition, the courage to take risk, to push harder, to endure discomfort in service of a future return. That is a particular kind of courage, and if you are in this conversation, you have almost certainly demonstrated it. But the courage required to step sideways, the courage to honestly evaluate what your life has cost beyond its financial balance sheet, to look clearly at the relationships that were neglected while you were building, to sit with the discomfort of that honest assessment without immediately converting it into a new action plan, that is a different courage entirely. And in my experience, it is one that far fewer people develop. Not because they are less capable, but because nobody ever teaches it. It is not incentivized by the culture around us. It is not measured by any external metric we were trained to value. Here is what I want you to understand about the mechanics of trust, because this is one of the most underappreciated financial concepts I have ever encountered. And I mean that with complete seriousness. Trust compounds. I want you to let that sit for a moment, because if you have spent your career in finance or business, you understand compounding on a molecular level. You understand that the magic of compound interest is not the returns themselves. It is the time. It is the patience to allow the mechanism to run without interference. Small, consistent inputs over a long enough timeline produce results that are structurally impossible to achieve any other way. Trust works in exactly the same way. Every interaction in which you demonstrate reliability, in which you sacrifice short-term personal advantage in favor of keeping your word, in which you absorb a cost to protect someone else's confidence in you, every one of those interactions is a deposit into a compounding account. And just like financial compounding, the returns are invisible for a long time. You don't feel them in year 1, you barely feel them in year 3, but somewhere around year 10, year 15, year 20, you look around and you realize that the quality of the people in your corner, the depth of the network that has organically formed around you, the number of people who would genuinely disrupt their own lives to help you if you needed it, the capital is worth more than most people's financial portfolios. And conversely, every time you ran over someone in pursuit of a deal, every time you were careless with a relationship because you calculated, consciously or unconsciously, that the relationship was worth less than the opportunity, every time you chose the short-term financial win over the slower trust-building path, those were withdrawals, and they compound in exactly the same way the deposits do, except in the opposite direction. I have watched people arrive at their 60s with extraordinary financial capital and catastrophically depleted relational capital. And I want to be precise about what that looks like, because it does not look the way people imagine it will. It does not look like obvious isolation or loneliness. It looks like busyness. It looks like a full calendar. It looks like networking events and business dinners and a phone that rings constantly with people who want something. What it does not look like is warmth. What it does not produce is the specific, irreplaceable quality of someone who calls you, not because they need something, but simply because they were thinking about you. That is a form of wealth, and it cannot be purchased retroactively. It can only be earned slowly over years of intentional investment. Now, I want to talk about something that I think is genuinely one of the most important frameworks for anyone in our generation to understand, and it is this. At 60, the scoreboard changes, fundamentally and irrevocably. And the tragedy is that most people do not realize the rules have changed until they are already well into the second half of the game, playing by the old scoring system, accumulating points in categories that no longer count. When you are in your 30s and 40s, the primary scorecard is financial, it is productivity, it is market position. Those metrics are real and they matter, and I am not diminishing the importance of building financial security. It is foundational, it is real, and the anxiety of genuine financial precarity is not something I would minimize for anyone. But by the time you are in your 60s, a completely different set of metrics has moved to the center of the board. Your health, your relationships, the quality and texture of the time you have left. The people who genuinely want to be in the same room as you say, not because you can write a check, but because being near you feels like something, because the relationship has actual roots, actual history, actual warmth. And here is what is important to understand about that shift. It does not happen gradually. It does not give you a long runway of warning. For many people, it arrives suddenly, triggered by a health event, by a loss, by a moment of unusual quiet in which the noise of productivity falls away and you look around and take honest stock of what is actually there. And what is or is not there in that moment is the result of decades of choices that felt at the time completely reasonable. Let me talk about the specific mechanics of building relational wealth, because I think our generation tends to approach relationships the same way we approached everything else, intuitively, reactively, without deliberate architecture. And that is a mistake. The same discipline that built your financial life, applied with the same rigor to your relationships, produces compounding returns that will matter far more to you at 75 than any investment thesis. Think about how you ran your professional life at its best. You had goals, you had timelines, you had checkpoints. You asked yourself regularly whether you were on track, and if you were not, you adjusted. You were strategic, you were intentional. You did not simply show up and hope the business would organize itself. Now ask yourself, did you ever apply that same architecture to the relationships that matter most? Did you ever sit down and think with equal seriousness about where you wanted those relationships to be in 5 years, 10 years? Did you identify the specific actions that would compound trust and depth over time? Did you calendar the things that build connection, not just the things that build revenue? Most of us did not. And I include myself in that honest accounting, because the culture of high achievement does not reward that kind of thinking. It rewards results that are measurable, visible, and quick. Relationships produce returns that are slow, invisible for long stretches of time, and impossible to enter into a spreadsheet. And so they get deprioritized, not out of malice, but out of the simple arithmetic of a busy person trying to allocate limited attention across unlimited demands. But here is the corrective truth that changes everything if you let it land. Your children do not need your money, they need your time, and specifically they need the quality of your presence when you give it. I have watched wealthy families operate for decades, and I can tell you with confidence that the ones that have genuine warmth, genuine connection between generations, those families did not produce that through financial generosity. They produced it through consistent, patient, sometimes inconvenient presence, through showing up when showing up was not convenient, through treating the relationship as the actual investment and allowing everything else to be the noise. There is a calculation that I think is important to make explicit. The money you spend on someone you love does not register in the emotional account the way time does. It does not build the same thing. A gift, however generous, communicates many things: generosity, care, even love, but it does not communicate the one thing that a human being at any age, at every age, most fundamentally needs to feel: that they are worth someone else's irreplaceable, non-renewable time, that they matter enough to interrupt the relentless forward motion of a productive life, that someone chose, without being obligated, to simply be present with them. This is not a soft sentiment, this is a mechanical truth about how human beings register importance. We are wired at a neurological level to track where attention goes. Attention is the currency of care, and you cannot substitute financial currency for attention currency without the recipient knowing, on some level, that a substitution has been made. I want to spend some time on what I consider to be one of the most important bodies of knowledge available to our generation. And it comes from a source that most people avoid thinking about. the specific regrets that human beings articulate when they are facing the end of life. This is not abstract philosophy, this is data. This is what people actually say from the clearest perspective most of us will ever have, when the normal social performances fall away and only the honest accounting remains. The first and most common regret is this: I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, rather than the life that others expected of me. Think carefully about what that means. It means that across decades of choices, career choices, financial choices, personal choices, many people navigated primarily by external approval, by what looked successful to others, by the metrics that their industry, their family, their social world said were the right ones to optimize for. And at the end, they look back and realize that they were executing someone else's definition of a good life, not their own. That the ambition they spent so much energy on was not at its root even their own ambition. It was a performance of what ambition was supposed to look like. If you are over 50 and you have the luxury of years still ahead of you, this is worth sitting with seriously. Not as a judgment, but as an invitation. What would your choices look like if you optimized entirely for your own honest assessment of what matters, not the version of your life that looks impressive from the outside, but the version that actually feels like yours from the inside? The second regret: I wish I hadn't worked so hard. And I want to address this carefully because I have enormous respect for the discipline and work ethic that defines most people in our generation. That work ethic is not the problem. The problem is a misallocation of that extraordinary energy toward things that were, on reflection, less important than they seemed. It is not the work itself that people regret. It is the opportunity cost of the work, the moments that were not taken, the relationships that were not invested in, the experiences that were deferred indefinitely and then became impossible. The third regret is particularly important for men of our generation. I wish I had the courage to express my feelings. We were shaped by a cultural framework that treated emotional restraint as a form of strength. And in many contexts, restraint is strength. I'm not arguing for an absence of discipline, but there is a specific failure mode in that cultural training, which is that we learn to suppress not just the counterproductive emotions, but the useful ones, the ones that build connection, the ones that tell the people we love how we actually feel about them. And the result, for many men in our generation, is a deep loneliness that is invisible even to themselves because they have been so thoroughly trained to not register certain signals that they no longer know what they are missing. If the people who are close to you have ever told you that you have difficulty with empathy, with presence, with expressing care, listen to that feedback. Not as an attack on who you are, but as the most valuable coaching you will ever receive. Because the ability to be emotionally present with another human being is not a weakness, it is a form of mastery. It is genuinely difficult for most high-achieving people. And the fact that it is difficult does not mean it is not worth the work. The fourth regret: I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. This one carries particular weight as we move through our 60s. The architecture of a life tends to scatter the people who matter to it. Careers take us in different directions. Children consume years of energy. And friendships, which unlike family relationships have no obligatory infrastructure holding them together, friendships quietly atrophy unless they are actively maintained. The slow drift of a friendship is one of the most invisible losses in a human life because it does not feel like a loss when it is happening. It simply feels like busyness, like the entirely reasonable prioritization of an immediate demand over a non-urgent connection. And then one day you look up and realize that someone who once knew you more deeply than almost anyone now feels like a stranger, and neither of you is quite sure how it happened. The antidote to this is what I would call structural intentionality. It is not enough to intend to stay connected. Intentions without structure are just wishes. What works is the same thing that works in business. Create the architecture that makes the behavior automatic. Make the gathering, the regular connection, the recurring point of contact. Make it a system rather than a resolution, because resolutions fade and systems persist. The fifth regret. I wish I had let myself be happier. And this one, I think, is the most philosophically interesting, because it implies something that most of us resist, that happiness is not a product of circumstances. It is not a reward for sufficient achievement. It is not something that arrives after the right combination of financial security and life conditions has been assembled. It is instead something much more internal and much more available than that. There is a perspective in contemplative philosophy that I have found genuinely useful, which is that the capacity for happiness is not something you need to find or build or earn. It is something you need to unlearn your way back to. Children have it naturally. The accumulation of anxiety, ambition, comparison, and identity investment progressively covers it. The work is not to add more on top of it. The work is to remove what is covering it. This has practical implications. If you are someone who finds it difficult to simply be at peace, if the quietness of a free afternoon produces discomfort rather than pleasure, if you always need a project or a problem to solve or a goal to pursue in order to feel like yourself, that is worth paying attention to. Not because there is anything wrong with ambition, but because a life that can only produce contentment through constant external achievement has a significant vulnerability built into it, because the external achievements eventually plateau. The deals stop coming with the same frequency, the projects wind down, and what you are left with, absent the ability to find genuine peace in ordinary moments, is a very uncomfortable silence. Now, I want to bring all of this together into something practical, because I think the people in our generation who are most at risk are not the people who failed financially. The financial failures are visible and they are painful, but they carry within them a clarity of feedback that forces adjustment. The people most at risk are the ones who succeeded financially, whose external lives look exactly like what success is supposed to look like, and who are only beginning to realize, somewhere in their early to mid-60s, that the definition of success they were operating with for 40 years was missing several of its most important dimensions. For those of us in that position, here is what I believe the work looks like now. First, take honest stock, not of your portfolio. Your advisors can do that. Take honest stock of your relational capital, the people who are genuinely in your corner, the relationships that have real depth, real history, real warmth, and the gaps, the relationships that should be there and are not, or that are thinner than they should be given how long they have existed. Second, be architectural. Create the structures that ensure the relationships you value will actually be maintained and deepened, not just vaguely intended. If you have family that matters to you, build the recurring rhythms that make connection reliable rather than dependent on individual acts of willpower. Make the gathering a tradition rather than a plan. Traditions survive changes in mood and circumstance in a way that plans do not. They become part of the identity of the group rather than items on a calendar. Third, take the feedback. If the people closest to you have ever offered you a critique about your presence, your emotional availability, your tendency to prioritize the wrong things, take it seriously. Not in a self-punishing way, but with the same disciplined receptivity that made you successful in business. In business, you learn to distinguish between feedback that was useful and feedback that was noise. Apply that same skill here. And be honest with yourself about which category the feedback from the people who know you best is most likely to fall into. Fourth, be intentional about health. I place this fourth, but in terms of foundational priority, it is arguably first, because the relational wealth, the depth of connection, the quality of presence you bring to the people you love, all of that requires a functioning body and a clear mind. The health decisions you make right now in your 50s and 60s are compounding investments that will determine the quality of your final decades in ways that no financial plan can compensate for. The money to access great health care is valuable, but no amount of money substitutes for the decades of choices that determine whether you need it. And fifth, and this is the one that I think requires the most courage for the kind of people who are likely listening to this. Give yourself permission to let the pursuit of more be genuinely complete. Not as a resignation, not as a defeat, but as the authentic recognition that you are, in fact, already enough, that the scoreboard that actually matters in the final accounting is not the one you have spent the most energy on, and that the time you still have, which is real and finite and extraordinarily valuable, is best allocated now not toward the next financial milestone, but toward the relationships, the health, and the quality of presence that will determine what your life actually felt like from the inside when you look back on it. Here is what wealth actually buys at the end of the day. It buys time. That is its most honest and complete definition. It removes the coercive demands on your hours that poverty and financial stress impose, and it gives you your time back. But the time is only worth what you do with it. And what the evidence of human life at its end most consistently points to is this: the time that mattered was the time spent in the presence of people who genuinely loved you. The time that mattered was the time spent in a body that was cared for. The time that mattered was the time spent being honestly, authentically yourself, not performing a version of yourself that the world around you had decided to reward. Money is real. The financial foundations that protect our families and preserve our options as we age, those are real and they matter, and anyone who tells you otherwise has not experienced genuine financial precarity. But money is the floor. It is not the ceiling. It is not the meaning. It is the conditions under which meaning becomes possible, and the meaning itself must be built deliberately with the same intelligence and discipline and long-term thinking that you applied to everything else that you built in your life. My name is Victor. And if you are also over 50, if you are at the point in life where the accumulation years are largely behind you and the question of what you actually built in the fullest sense of that word is beginning to press with a new kind of urgency, then I want to leave you with this. The most valuable thing you have right now is not in your portfolio. It is not in any account. It cannot be audited or appraised or transferred. It is the years ahead of you and the clarity with which you choose to spend them. That clarity is earned not by more achievement, but by the willingness to honestly ask what you have always, beneath all the ambition and all the striving, actually wanted, and to have the courage at this stage of life, when you have finally earned it more than anyone, to actually live toward that answer. That is what it means to be truly wealthy, and it took most of us far longer than it should have to learn it.